All right, it's 6 o'clock, so I guess I'll get started. Um, as I said, I'm Robert Silbernagel, the author of The Cadottes, a fur trade family on Lake Superior. And welcome to my Book Bites program. I want to begin with a few slides about my book, why I wrote it and how, and then I'll read a short passage from the book. And finally, I'll try and answer some of your questions. So let's see if I can get the shared screen going here. And here we go. This is the cover of my book. It was published by the Wisconsin Historical Society Press last May, so it's been out just about a year. It is about the Cadotte family, who were of French Canadian and Ojibwe ancestry. In the book, I focus a lot, excuse me, just a second, on Michel Cadotte and his Ojibwe wife, Equaysayway, who lived and traded on Madeline Island near Bayfield, Wisconsin. But I also give a lot of attention to Michel's father, Jean-Baptiste Cadotte Sr., and his brother, Jean-Baptiste Cadotte Jr., as well as Michel and Equaysaway's descendants. Well, a lot of people have asked me why I wrote this book. First of all, Lake Superior has long fascinated me. My wife and I both grew up in Wisconsin, and I had visited a couple of times as a child. But my wife, Judy, and I have visited many times over the past 25 years, especially Bayfield and Madeline Island. And this is a drawing of Madeline Island in the early 19th century. You can see the church in the far background, some houses on the shore near where the village of La Pointe is now, a warehouse stretching out into the bay with a small ship beside it, and some canoes with Indians in the foreground. But it wasn't just Madeline Island or Bayfield we visited. We've been all around the lake from Thunder Bay to Sault Ste. Marie. And wherever we traveled, we bought books about the area's history and the fur trade. And what I found in reading those books was that the name Cadotte appeared often in journals and documents of the fur trade era, as well as on physical locations such as this one. This is a plaque where Michel and Equaysaway Cadotte had a fur trade post on Madeline Island. They also had their home and a small farm there. They raised their children there, as well as some of their grandchildren. Well, as I did the research, the Cadottes kept appearing even when I was not specifically looking for them. And I became intrigued with who they were and how involved in the fur trade in the Lake Superior region they were. And all this began a decade-long research project to learn more about the Cadottes and the fur trade around Lake Superior. That research included many books, documents, journals, early newspaper articles. But it also included some firsthand experiences, such as snowshoeing on old fur trade trails in northern Wisconsin that led south from Lake Superior into the area where we know Michel and Equaysaway Cadotte conducted part of their fur trade business. Or it involved kayaking on parts of Lake Superior near Madeline Island and other areas where we're certain that the Cadottes would have been paddling their canoes during the fur trade era. Now, I don't consider myself a great adventurer, and I was not trying to recreate the Cadotte's life or a fur trader's life from 200 years ago, but I wanted to experience a little better how they lived and worked to try to better understand the fur trade existence and what the Cadottes went through. To that end, I also talked with other people today who are engaged in activities that the Cadottes might have been engaged in, such as making maple sugar, trapping animals, gathering wild rice. And I also talked with Cadotte descendants who are alive today. Additionally, I wanted to learn more about the critters and the industry that drove the fur trade. So for instance, how many beaver were trapped over the centuries of the fur trade? I had a hard time finding anything on that. I did discover some scientific papers that argue that somewhere between 30 to 60 million bison or buffalo were killed in North America during the 19th century. And based on records from the fur trade posts operated by the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, I think the number of beaver killed was probably 5 to 10 times that. But that was over more than 200 years, not just a single century. In addition to beaver, many other animals, such as foxes, lynx, bear, deer, wolves, were trapped or shot for their furs. But based on those Hudson's Bay, Northwest Company records and those of other fur companies, it's clear that beaver were far and away number one, probably by a magnitude of 10 times over the closest other animal caught or killed for its fur. It's interesting to note that the fur trade was initially part of the economy of most North American colonies along the Atlantic coast, from New England as far south as the Carolinas. But soon beaver and other valuable fur animals were trapped out or killed off in those colonies, and they turned to other economic sources of revenue. But the fur trade remained the primary economic driver of New France, which became Canada, under both French and British control for over 200 years. And the reason, of course, is because people wanted beaver pelts to make fur hats. Felt hats has been around quite a while. The earliest written reference for beaver felt hats we have that still exist today comes from Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 1300s. In it, he describes a fashionable merchant of Ellesmere wearing a Flemish beaver hat. And this is a drawing from an early edition of the Canterbury Tales, showing that fashionable merchant of Ellesmere with presumably the beaver hat he's wearing as he rides horseback. Well, Chaucer's book was written before Europeans arrived in great numbers in North America to colonize it and to begin taking its resources. So the beaver he described for the Flemish beaver hat probably came from Scandinavia or Russia. But it wasn't long before colonists arrived and began trapping North American beaver in earnest. And over the centuries, many different styles of hats were developed, as you can see in this slide on the right. Several different kinds of military hats, as well as a number of men's fashion top hats. Women also had fashion felt hats, but not as many as the men. It was really the men's hats that drove the industry. Well, naturally, when there was that much demand, making hats became a major industry. First in Europe, in England, France, Spain, and Holland. And hats from those countries were shipped all over Europe and elsewhere around the globe. Later, companies arrived in North America or began operating in North America. One company in England, Christie's and Company, has been making felt hats for 247 years. They made hats for King George III who was king during the American Revolution, and for other royalty. They made more recently hats for movies like The Godfather, and they still make top hats and derbies. Additionally, Stetsons and derbies, which came later, are still being manufactured today, many with hybrid furs, including rabbit and others, but you can still buy pure beaver felt hats, and they're fairly expensive. This, by the way, is a wood cutting from the early 19th century, showing people working in the hat making industry. Well, the fur trade was more than just trappers, men we've come to know in the United States, like Jim Bridger and Kit Carson. It was a global affair, and this man, Sir Alexander Mackenzie, was deeply involved in it. He was knighted after he became the first European to cross North America from the Atlantic to the Pacific by foot, by horseback, but mostly by canoe. He reached the Pacific Ocean in 1793, 10 years before Lewis and Clark set out on their voyage of discovery. He also was the first European to reach the Arctic Ocean by an inland route, and that route is by a river we now know as the Mackenzie River. But he wasn't just an explorer. Alexander Mackenzie was deeply involved in the fur trade business with the Northwest Company and with other firms. Both of the Cadotte brothers worked for those firms and knew him personally. Well, he described, as this slide says, the global fur trade as a very heavy business because it involves shipping furs to Europe, China, the Caribbean, and paying heavy tariffs to companies like the British East India Company so that they could use their ships to get them across the oceans. Later, many companies, including the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company, had their own ships. Additionally, the fur trade involved the creation of an entire lending industry developed in Europe and North America just to serve the fur trade. Well, while ships were crossing the ocean to take furs one way, provisions the other way, canoes were crossing the lakes and rivers of North America to get goods to the traders and bring the furs back. This map shows one long canoe trip that was undertaken every year for probably 40 years by people working out of Montreal, primarily with the Northwest Company. It was roughly 1,000 miles from Montreal to Grand Portage on the west end of Lake Superior. They headed west from Montreal up to the Ottawa River into Georgia Bay at the north end of Lake Huron, through Sault Ste. Marie, the falls of Sault Ste. Marie, then onto Lake Superior, either by the northern route or the little bit longer southern route, which went past Madeline Island where the Cadotte brothers were, or where Michel and Equaysayway were, I should say. It also involved many portages, and the people coming from Montreal to Grand Portage were traveling in huge canoes that could hold up to 8 people and many, many packs of furs or provisions to take the winter traders. And the winners, as they were known, would come into Grand Portage after spending the previous season, winter season, in the backcountry, trapping, trading with Indian tribes of various tribes, and generally trying to survive a long winter in the rough wilderness country. Some of them would then head back into the backcountry, going as many as 1,000, some even up to 2,000 miles from Grand Portage via much smaller canoes and by foot. But they would spend about 2 weeks at Grand Portage getting resupplied from the supplies the Montrealers brought in, and there would be business meetings, and there would also be a pretty good party going on. Then the Montrealers would head back to Montreal with their large canoes loaded with furs, send them up the St. Lawrence River and onto the Atlantic Ocean to be sent over to Europe for processing, while the winners headed back into the backcountry to begin trading for another season. The Cadotte brothers attended the rendezvous on several occasions we know of, but they didn't head west as much as some of the other traders. Instead, they spent most of their time in northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and the upper peninsula of Michigan. And they went with their Voyager employees and their Indian relatives and allies to trap and trade for furs. But the Cadottes were much more than just backcountry trappers. The family business ledger shows they had a complicated business operations. taking goods like cloth, pots, guns, and tobacco into the backcountry to trade with Indians and other traders, while keeping contact with merchants in Montreal to sell their furs and purchase trade goods, and to look after their families who might be in Montreal attending school or for other reasons there. The Cadottes walked regularly between the rough world of wilderness traders and the more urbanized world of merchants and financiers. Now, I don't know what kind of hats the Cadottes wore. I've found nothing to describe their headgear, but Michel Cadotte, his father and brother, continually surprised English and American visitors and traders by how educated they were and how civilized by the standards of the time. They also visited cities like Montreal, and they hobnobbed with wealthy merchants, and they knew what their furs were harvested for and manufactured into. So I like to view them like the people in this print from 19th century fur trade mission. This is one of the big canoes which might have come from Montreal. You can see the British Canadian flag in the background. The gentleman in the middle with a bright blue jacket isn't paddling, so he must be an important either trader or just a visitor, and he's wearing a very fancy top hat, while some of the voyagers who are paddling or steering wear hats that look like they were once top hats, but sort of may have been in different states of disrepair. Anyway, I like to think that Cadottes may have been out paddling their canoe wearing top hats made from felt of the beavers they helped to trap. Well, that's my slideshow. Now I'd like to read a passage from my book, and I think it shows how the Cadotte family, and especially Michel and Equaysayway, adopted as their world changing. It's from chapter 19, A Method to Their Marriage. Nothing in the record of Michel Cadotte's life suggests that he was prone to impetuous, or that he and his partner, Equaysayway, were prone to making spur-of-the-moment decisions. So when they decided to get married in a Catholic church in 1830, more than 40 years after they first became husband and wife under Ojibwe custom, they must have had a good reason. In fact, they had multiple reasons to have their marriage recognized under European American rules. Notably, important court cases were changing how marriages between European men and Native women were viewed by authorities. Treaties had been forged that made marriage issues more significant for mixed ancestry couples like the Cadottes. And the substantial cultural changes were on the horizon as the first of the Protestant missionaries began to arrive at Lake Superior. To try and understand the Cadotte's choice, I visited St. Anne's Catholic Church, which is on Mackinac Island, to view the official record of their wedding. I wondered what else was happening about the same time that might have made a marriage recognized by European and American authorities more urgent. It became apparent that Michel and Equaysayway were responding to the changing circumstances of their world. They were demonstrating the same adaptability and resiliency they had shown at different periods in their lives when situations demanded change. I believe that Michel and Equaysayway were very adaptable throughout their long lives, but so were many of their Ojibwe relatives and various French Canadians or people of mixed French Canadian and Indian ancestry who operated in the fur trade industry around Lake Superior as well. So I hope if you read my book, you'll come to appreciate just how important that feature of their characters was to adapt as their world encountered great changes, political, cultural, religious, during the years they were trying to make a living in the fur trade business. Well, thank you all for attending this Book Bites, and I'll try to answer some questions now.
Bob, we have one. Bob, this is Kristen Gilpatrick. I'm the marketing manager for the Press Talking. We did get one question so far about how many generations of Cadottes were involved in the fur trade. Like,
at least 5. Well, let's see. So beginning in the late 1600s, 1671, we know, or there are reports of Jean-Baptiste Cadotte Sr.'s grandfather, a man named Madeline Cadotte, who went by Cadotte at that point. In 1671, he was probably the first of the Cadotte family to attend or to visit Lake Superior. He was involved briefly in the fur trade. Then several of his sons were in the fur trade, probably not so much as Lake Superior as further east on the lakes and areas closer to Montreal. Then Jean-Baptiste Cadotte Sr. became involved in the mid to early 1700s. So that's 3 generations. Michel Cadotte and his brother, Jean-Baptiste Cadotte, and then at least 2 of Michel Cadotte's sons were involved, and probably some of their grandsons, even though the fur trade, by the time the grandsons were involved, was not as big a business as it had once been. And in addition to that, that's just following one line of the Cadotte family established by Madeline Cadotte here in North America. There are other branches of the family with people that were also involved in the fur trade for many years, maybe several generations as well.
hi, Bob, it's Kristen again. I'm just waiting to see if we have some additional questions. But I would like to just let people know, and perhaps you can comment because you've been there as well, that they can go to Madeline Island to the Wisconsin Historical Site up there and learn more about the family as well. The book, of course, is available up there too, as well as your favorite book retailer and our online store.
Yeah, and it's a great little museum there that has not just stuff on the Cadottes, but on the history of the whole area from Native Americans prior to European contact, to the fur trade era, to more recent fishing, lumber industry, and stuff like that. So I really enjoy that museum, and we've been there a number of times.
Wonderful. Thank you again so much, Bob, for this great Book Bites and this history discussion. I'm sure that there will be a couple more questions that pop up after we sign off tonight, and we'll monitor those and make sure to answer those in the comments as well. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Kristen.